At 6:02 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, Ensign Albert Kyle Ernest sat strapped into the cockpit of a Grumman TBF, one Avenger on Midway Island, watching ground crews fuel an aircraft that had never been tested in combat. He was 25 years old. 0 combat hours. 0 enemy kills. Behind him in the dorsal turret sat Seaman First Class J. Manning, just 20 years old. Below, in the cramped ventral compartment, crouched radioman Third Class Harry Fryer, 17 years old, barely old enough to vote, now flying into history. The Japanese were coming. That morning, 108 enemy aircraft were inbound to strike Midway, supported by 4 fleet carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, the core of the Kido Butai, the same force that had shattered Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Ernest's aircraft was 8T-1, Bureau number 00380, the very first TBF Avenger ever built. It had arrived at Pearl Harbor 6 days earlier. Ernest and 5 other pilots from Torpedo Squadron 8 had flown them to Midway just 3 days ago. The rest of VT-8 was somewhere at sea aboard USS Hornet, flying the obsolete TBD Devastator. This detachment had the Navy's newest torpedo bomber. Bigger, faster, stronger. Nobody knew if that would matter. Their commander, Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling, was 32, already considered old by the younger pilots. 2 days earlier, he had gathered them in a crude briefing room and told them the truth. The Japanese fleet was coming. For carriers, the full striking force of the Imperial Navy. Midway had 52 combat aircraft to stop them. 3 American carriers were somewhere north, waiting in ambush. If Midway fell, Pearl Harbor was next. At 5:55, a truck tore down the flight line. Marines were shouting. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees, 150 nautical miles. Launch everything. Ernest brought the throttle forward. The right Cyclone radial engine roared to life. He had never dropped a live torpedo. None of them had, except Fieberling. At 6 o'clock, 6 TBF Avengers lifted off Midway. No fighter escort. The Marine Wildcats were already scrambling to defend the island itself. Ernest tucked in behind Fieberling's aircraft as they climbed to 8,000 feet, turned northwest, and flew out over open ocean. Nothing but water. 150 miles of it. By 1942, torpedo bombing was a suicide mission. You had to fly low, straight, and slow, directly into the teeth of enemy fire. The Japanese knew this. Their Zero fighters were faster, more agile, and deadly. At Coral Sea, just a month earlier, American torpedo squadrons had been annihilated. Most torpedo bomber crews did not survive their first attack. At 7:10, Ernest saw the enemy fleet. For massive carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers. And above them, black specks diving fast. Zeros. Too many to count. Fieberling pushed his nose down. The other 5 Avengers followed. Ernest shoved his stick forward. Manning opened fire from the turret. Fryer fired upward from below. Tracers filled the sky. The first Avenger exploded midair. The second rolled over and slammed into the sea. The third vanished in flame. Then the fourth. Ernest saw Fieberling's aircraft spiral down, trailing smoke. 5 Avengers gone in less than 3 minutes. Ernest was alone. Zeros came at him from 3 directions. A 20mm cannon round punched through his windshield. Glass shards tore into his neck. Blood flooded inside his flight suit. His instrument panel detonated. The compass froze. Airspeed gone. Altimeter gone. Radio dead. Manning's gun went silent. Then Fryer's voice came over the intercom, strained and shaking. Manning's hit. Bad. I think he's dead. Fryer himself was wounded. Ernest was flying 200 feet above the ocean. He opened the bomb bay doors and released his torpedo at the nearest cruiser. It missed. More cannon fire ripped through the fuselage. The elevator controls went dead. The stick stopped responding. The Avenger should have crashed. Instead, impossibly, it stayed level. If you want to know whether Ernest survived the flight back to Midway, please hit that like button. Every like helps YouTube share this story. And subscribe if you haven't already. Ernest was still under fire. Rounds slammed into the armor plate behind his seat. Hydraulics were gone. One landing gear was stuck down. Manning was unquestionably dead. Blood filled the turret. The engine was still running. And when Ernest adjusted the elevator trim tabs, the aircraft responded. Barely. He was now controlling a 3-ton aircraft using trim tabs meant only for fine adjustments. Ernest eased the crippled Avenger into a cloud bank. The Zeros broke off. They assumed he was finished. He turned east by dead reckoning, flying toward the rising sun. If he missed Midway, the next landfall was Pearl Harbor, 1,200 miles away. He had maybe 2 hours of fuel, one wheel, no instruments, a dead gunner, a wounded radio man, and 73 bullet holes he didn't yet know about. He flew at 2,000 feet inside the cloud. Every trim adjustment made the aircraft shudder. The Cyclone engine ran rough, but it ran. That was all that mattered. At 7:45, he broke out of the clouds. The sun was higher now. He corrected course slightly. Fryer asked if they were going to make it. Ernest didn't answer. He didn't know. At 8:20, he saw black smoke on the horizon. Midway was burning. The Japanese strike had hit the island while he attacked their fleet. He turned toward the smoke. 10 minutes later, the island came into view. Runway, sand, buildings. He'd found it. Now he had to land. One wheel. No hydraulics. No flaps. No radio. And Marines below who had just been bombed and were ready to shoot anything that moved. Ernest climbed to 1,500 feet and began the emergency approach pattern, a precise sequence of turns that signaled a damaged friendly aircraft. Left turn, straight leg. Right turn, straight leg. Anti-aircraft guns tracked him. They did not fire. They recognized the pattern. One of their own was coming home. Ernest completed the emergency pattern and turned on a final approach. The runway on Midway stretched 6,000 feet, more than enough distance under normal circumstances. This was not normal. A TBF Avenger normally landed at 75 knots with full flaps. Ernest had no flaps, no hydraulics, and only one landing gear. He would be touching down at over 100 knots. Fast, dangerously fast. He adjusted the trim tabs again. The nose dipped slightly. The Avenger began to descend. 300 feet, 200, 100. The island rushed up beneath him. Marines were already running toward the runway. Ambulances, fire trucks, crash crews. They knew exactly what they were about to witness. 50 feet. The right main landing gear was down and locked. The left gear was jammed, fully retracted. When the right wheel touched, the aircraft would want to pivot violently left and cartwheel. Standard procedure for a one-wheel landing was simple in theory. Come in as slow as possible. Keep the damaged wing up as long as you can. Ernest didn't have that option. He was coming in hot, with almost no control authority. 20 feet. He eased the trim tabs to level the aircraft. The Avenger settled. At 9:44, the right wheel touched concrete. The aircraft bounced once. Then again. The right gear held. The left wing dropped. Ernest fought it with everything he had. Rudder hard right, trim tabs working constantly. The left wingtip scraped the runway. Sparks exploded along the concrete. The propeller was still turning. If the wing dug in, the aircraft would flip and disintegrate. The Avenger slewed sharply left. Ernest kept the rudder buried. The tail swung around. The aircraft spun 90 degrees and stopped. The engine was still running. Ernest shut it down. Silence. For 3 seconds, he sat motionless in the cockpit. He was alive. On the ground. At Midway, Marines surrounded the aircraft instantly. Medics climbed onto the wing and forced the canopy open. Ernest tried to stand. His legs failed him. They lifted him out. Blood soaked his flight suit. The neck wound had been bleeding for 90 minutes. Ernest pointed toward the turret. Manning's up there. 2 medics climbed to the turret. They looked inside, then climbed back down. One of them shook his head. Ernest already knew. He had known since 7:15, when Manning's gun went silent. Fryer was pulled from the ventral compartment. He was conscious, wounded, but walking. 17 years old, and he had survived what almost no one survived. Ground crews swarmed the Avenger. They began counting bullet holes. 7 in the engine cowling, 15 in the fuselage, 20 in the wings, 30 in the tail. They stopped at 73. 64 hits from 7 7mm machine guns. 9 hits from 20mm cannon fire. The elevator control cables were completely severed. Hydraulic lines cut. Compass destroyed. One propeller blade had a bullet hole straight through it. A photographer arrived. Bureau number 00380 had to be documented. The first TBF Avenger in combat. The only survivor of 6. Flew 200 miles with no elevator control. Landed on one wheel. The aircraft was shipped to Pearl Harbor for examination. Engineers needed to understand how it had stayed airborne. Ernest was taken to the base hospital. Doctors removed glass fragments from his neck. The wound wasn't deep, but he had lost a dangerous amount of blood. Physically, he would recover. Emotionally, the cost was unbearable. 5 pilots from Midway were dead. J. Manning was dead. 15 more VT-8 pilots had launched that same morning from USS Hornet in obsolete TBD Devastators. Only one came back. Ensign George Gay, pulled from the ocean the next day. Torpedo Squadron 8 had sent 21 aircraft into combat. 48 men. 3 survived. 94% casualties. The highest loss rate of any American squadron in a single action in the entire war. And the battle was not over. While Ernest lay in a hospital bed, American dive bombers were attacking. By noon on June 4th, the outcome of the Battle of Midway was clear. Dive bombers from USS Enterprise and USS Yorktown caught 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, with their decks full of fueled, armed aircraft. All 3 were burning. A 4th carrier was struck that afternoon and sank the next day. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers in one day. The backbone of the Imperial Navy was broken. The carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor were gone. And Torpedo Squadron 8 had made it possible. The 6 TBFs from Midway attacked first. Then 15 TBDs from Hornet. Then torpedo planes from Enterprise and Yorktown. Not a single torpedo hit. But the effect was decisive. They pulled Japanese fighters down to sea level. They forced constant evasive maneuvers. They prevented a counterstrike. And while the Zeros slaughtered torpedo planes at wave-top height, American dive bombers arrived unopposed. VT-8 bought that window with blood. 45 men dead. 21 aircraft destroyed. 0 torpedo hits. And the course of the Pacific War changed forever. Ernest remained hospitalized on Midway for 2 days. On June 5th, Admiral Chester Nimitz flew in from Pearl Harbor. He visited Ernest personally. The admiral asked what happened. Ernest told him everything. The launch. The attack. Manning killed. Flying home using only trim tabs. Landing on one wheel. Nimitz listened in silence. When Ernest finished, the admiral paused. Then he said, "Your return flight was an epic in the history of combat aviation." Those words mattered. Nimitz knew combat. 2 weeks later, the Navy announced Ernest would receive 2 Navy Crosses for June 4th. One for pressing home the attack. One for bringing his aircraft and crew back. 2 Navy Crosses in a single mission. Almost unheard of. Fryer received the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Purple Heart. The awards meant little compared to the losses. Lieutenant Fieberling was dead. Every other Midway TBF crewman was dead. VT-8 had been annihilated. The squadron was rebuilt in July. New pilots, new crews, new aircraft, assigned to USS Saratoga and sent to Guadalcanal. The war was far from over. Ernest went with them. He was 25 years old. And now, whether he wanted it or not, one of the most experienced torpedo bomber pilots in the Pacific. 3 Navy Crosses. Dozens of strike missions. And after Midway, not a single aircraft lost under his command. June 4th had not been luck. Ernest had proven something far more important. He was one of the Navy's best torpedo bomber pilots. Not because he was aggressive. Not because he chased glory. But because he was calm when everything was going wrong. He made decisions under fire. He recognized when to press an attack and when to disengage. He understood damaged aircraft, failing systems, and the thin line between courage and recklessness. Those qualities kept pilots alive. The Navy noticed. Instead of assigning Ernest to a desk job or parading him for publicity, they did something more telling. They made him an instructor. New torpedo bomber pilots needed to learn from someone who had been there, someone who could explain, without exaggeration, what worked and what got you killed. Throughout 1943, Ernest trained the next generation of naval aviators. He taught them how to approach a target under fire, how to evade fighters, how to fly an aircraft that was no longer fully controllable, how to think 5 seconds ahead when instruments stopped working. Most of all, he taught them how to survive. But Ernest did not remain an instructor forever. The Navy still needed experienced combat pilots. When the Pacific War ended in August 1945, Ernest stayed in uniform. He had joined in 1941 expecting to serve a few years. Naval aviation had become his life. In the years after the war, his missions changed. But the danger did not disappear. He flew hurricane reconnaissance missions, taking modified B-17s directly into violent storms to collect weather data that saved lives. He flew search and rescue, long overwater patrols, emergency response missions where mistakes were fatal. It was not combat, but it demanded the same skills: situational awareness, calm decision-making, the ability to bring damaged aircraft home. He was promoted steadily. Lieutenant, lieutenant commander, commander, captain. He commanded squadrons. He commanded air stations. By the 1960s, Ernest was placed in command of Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia, one of the largest naval air stations on the East Coast. Thousands of personnel, hundreds of aircraft. The young man who had flown a shattered Avenger back to Midway using trim tabs alone was now responsible for an entire air station. Ernest retired from the Navy in 1973, 31 years of service. He had witnessed the transformation of naval aviation from slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers to supersonic jet aircraft, from a Navy fighting for survival in 1942 to the most powerful naval force in the world. After retirement, Ernest rarely spoke publicly about Midway. Other veterans became well known. George Gay wrote a book and appeared in documentaries, often called the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8. Ernest and Harry Fryer joked privately that they were the other sole survivors. But Ernest never sought attention. He had done his duty. That was enough. Midway remained the defining moment of his life. June 4, 1942. The day he lost friends. The day he flew an aircraft that should not have stayed airborne. The day he discovered what he could do when everything fell apart. Those 90 minutes, from the Japanese fleet back to Midway, tested him in ways nothing else ever would. Historians would later dissect the battle endlessly. They analyzed tactics, intelligence failures, timing, luck. But one conclusion never changed. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons made victory possible. VT-8 from Hornet and Midway. VT-6 from Enterprise. VT-3 from Yorktown. 51 torpedo bombers launched. 35 shot down. 89 men killed. Not a single torpedo hit. And yet, strategically decisive. The torpedo attacks dragged Japanese fighters down to sea level. They forced constant evasive maneuvering. They delayed the counterstrike. And while the Zeros were busy destroying torpedo planes at wave-top height, American dive bombers arrived overhead, unopposed. For Japanese carriers burned. The Pacific War turned in one morning. Ernest understood this better than most. He had flown through the debris of aircraft that had been intact seconds earlier. He had watched friends die. He knew the sacrifice mattered, but knowing never made it easier. TBF Avenger Bureau number 00380 was eventually retired. The aircraft that had been first off the production line and survived 73 bullet holes was preserved in museums. A reminder of what could be survived through skill and determination. A reminder of the price paid at Midway. Harry Fryer also made the Navy his career. The 17-year-old radio man survived Midway, flew combat missions throughout the Pacific, was commissioned in 1945, and retired as a commander in 1970. 25 years of service. Like Ernest, he rarely spoke publicly about June 4th. The two men stayed in contact after the war. They shared an understanding that required no explanation. What it felt like to be the only survivors. What it meant to watch 5 aircraft explode in 3 minutes. What it took to fly 200 miles in a dying aircraft. They didn't need to talk about it. They already knew. Over time, Midway became one of the most studied battles in military history. Naval War College, staff colleges, books, documentaries. Again and again, historians returned to the same conclusion. Tactically disastrous, strategically decisive. Without the torpedo squadrons, the dive bombers might have faced full fighter opposition. The battle might have ended differently. The war might have lasted years longer. The TBF Avenger went on to become one of the most successful naval aircraft of World War II. Over 9,000 built. Reliable. Tough. Deadly. Midway was its brutal debut, but not its legacy. And Bureau number 00380 remained its symbol. 73 hits, and it flew home. Engineers never fully explained how. Elevator cables severed. Hydraulics destroyed. Fuel lines punctured but sealed. 7 hits to the engine, and it kept running. Impossible. But impossible had not applied on June 4, 1942. Impossible was flying in formation while 5 aircraft exploded around you. Impossible was navigating 200 miles with no instruments. Impossible was landing on one wheel at 120 miles per hour. Ernest had done all of it. Then he spent the next 3 decades serving quietly, without seeking recognition. Albert Kyle Ernest died on October 27, 2009, 92 years old, 67 years after Midway. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, 3 Navy Crosses, 31 years of service. One of the last survivors of Torpedo Squadron 8. Harry Fryer outlived him by 7 years. He died in May 2016 at age 90. The last 2 survivors of the Midway TBF detachment were gone, but what they represented remained. Courage under impossible circumstances, duty when survival was unlikely, the willingness to fly into hell because someone ordered you to, and because your country needed you to. The story survived because people remembered. Veterans preserved records. Historians conducted interviews. The Navy kept documentation. And photographs of Bureau number 00380 still exist. A battered aircraft. And proof that sometimes survival itself becomes history. The bullet-riddled TBF became more than wreckage. It became evidence of what could be survived. After World War II, military aviation changed almost beyond recognition. Jet engines replaced propellers. Missiles replaced torpedoes. Carriers grew larger. Aircraft grew faster, higher, more complex. But the fundamental lessons did not change. Training matters. Discipline matters. And above all, the ability to function when everything is going wrong matters. Young naval aviators in the 21st century still study the Battle of Midway. They examine the mistakes in detail. Why Hornets Air Group flew the wrong heading. Why torpedo squadrons attacked without fighter escort. Why American torpedoes failed so often. Why coordination between air groups broke down at critical moments. Those failures are studied so they are never repeated. But Midway is also studied for what went right. The intelligence breakthrough that revealed Japanese plans. The positioning of American carriers north of the island. The decision to launch strikes immediately, despite incomplete information. The willingness of pilots to attack knowing they were unlikely to survive. Those decisions won the battle. Ernest's flight back to Midway is now taught as a case study in aviation survival. How he maintained control using only trim tabs. How he navigated without instruments. How he executed a textbook emergency landing procedure despite catastrophic damage. Flight instructors use his example to teach student pilots what is possible when panic is replaced by discipline. The 73 bullet holes tell their own story. They show where a TBF Avenger could absorb damage and keep flying. The engine could take multiple hits. The wings could be riddled and still generate lift. The tail could be shredded and still provide stability. But the elevator control cables were vulnerable. One burst in the wrong place, and pitch control was gone. Ernest survived because he understood what few pilots would have realized in that moment. That trim tabs could be used as emergency flight controls. Most pilots would not have thought of it. Most would not have had the skill to execute it. Modern aircraft are more resilient. They have redundant systems, backup controls, computerized flight assistance. But they are also more complex. More things can fail. And pilots still need the same fundamental skills Ernest possessed. Situational awareness, improvisation, calm decision-making under pressure. Those skills do not change with technology. Every year on June 4th, the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 is commemorated. Ceremonies are held at naval air stations. Names are read aloud. Moments of silence are observed. 45 men died attacking the Japanese fleet. 3 survived. The ratio tells the story better than words. VT-8 received 2 Presidential Unit citations, one for Midway and one for Guadalcanal. No other squadron received that honor twice during the war. Those citations are displayed at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola. Nearby are photographs of the pilots. Young men, most in their 20s. Some, like Harry Fryer, still teenagers. They look confident, ready. They had no idea what was coming. Museums preserve aircraft, uniforms, medals, and photographs. But the real preservation happens when the story is told. When someone explains why 6 TBF Avengers attacked without fighter cover, why 5 were destroyed in 3 minutes, why the 6th flew 200 miles home using trim tabs alone, and why it mattered. The story matters because it shows what human beings are capable of. Not superheroes. Not movie characters. Real people. A 25-year-old pilot with no combat experience. A 17-year-old radio man who lied about his age to enlist. A 20-year-old gunner who died in his turret. Ordinary people who did extraordinary things because their country needed them to. That is why the story survives. Not because it is about technology. Not because it is about tactics. But because it is about people who faced impossible odds and refused to quit. People who watched friends die and kept flying. People who brought dying aircraft home because giving up was not acceptable. Every generation needs these stories. Not to glorify war, but to understand what previous generations endured, what they sacrificed, what they made possible. The world we live in exists because people like Ernest, Fryer, and Manning flew into hell on June 4, 1942. Because they did their duty even when survival seemed impossible. Because they refused to fail even when failure seemed certain. The Japanese shot Ernest's aircraft 73 times. They killed his gunner. They wounded his radio man. They destroyed his instruments. They severed his control cables. They should have killed him, but they didn't. And the reason they didn't matters. It wasn't the aircraft that survived. Bureau number 00380 was just metal, wires, and fuel. It should have fallen into the Pacific. The engine should have seized. The airframe should have broken apart. Physics said it could not make it home. But Ernest was not bound by physics alone. When the elevator failed, he used trim tabs. When the instruments died, he navigated by the sun. When the hydraulics were gone, he landed on one wheel. He adapted. He improvised. He refused to accept that survival was impossible. That is the lesson. Not that war is glorious. Not that sacrifice is easy, but that human beings can overcome impossible circumstances when they stay calm, think clearly, and refuse to quit. Torpedo Squadron 8 paid a terrible price on June 4th. 45 men killed. Families shattered. Futures erased. Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling never saw his 33rd birthday. Jay Manning never came home to Washington. 14 other pilots died that morning. Their sacrifice bought 6 minutes. 6 minutes when Japanese fighters were out of position. 6 minutes that allowed American dive bombers to attack unopposed. 6 minutes that changed the war. Was it worth it? The men who died cannot answer that question. The 3 who survived carried it for the rest of their lives. Ernest lived 67 years after Midway. Fryer lived 74. They built families. They served their country for decades. They died old men. But June 4th never left them. The sound of Manning's gun going silent. The sight of 5 aircraft exploding. The 90 minutes flying home not knowing if they would live. They made it. And because they did, we know the story. We know what happened at Midway. We know the price that was paid. We know what human beings are capable of when everything is falling apart. Modern pilots still study this mission. Not for heroics, but for lessons. Stay calm. Assess your options. Use whatever tools you have left. Adapt. Improvise. Never accept that failure is inevitable. Ernest had trim tabs. Most people have something. The question is whether you recognize it when everything else has failed. That is why this story still matters. Not because of aircraft. Not because of tactics. But because it proves that when quitting is not an option, there is always another way.